Suppose that an honorable master, having a great number of servants, in different capacities, under his authority, were to appoint for some of them a certain piece of important work, and pointedly to prescribe the whole plan to be scrumptiously observed in carrying it forward, but at the same time were to require another servant to take notice that they faithfully observe their Lord's prescriptions. We would not certainly from that conclude that the person taking such oversight for the time was the proper judge how the work was to be done, or the author of the regulations to be observed by the performers of it. The application to the case before us is abundantly obvious. As to the magistrate's power of calling synods and being present at them, our reformers explain themselves in the 51st of the above-mentioned propositions. Quote, "The magistrate," say they, "calleth together synods, not as touching those things which are proper to synods, but in respect of the things which are common to synods, with other meetings, and civil public assemblies, that is, not as they are assemblies in the name of Christ to treat of matters spiritual, but as they are public assemblies within his territories." Unquote. But even supposing it should be rather a stretch for our assembly to signify, as they do in their act at Edinburgh, August 27, 1647, quote, "that the necessity of occasional assemblies should be first remonstrate to the magistrate by humble supplication, before the church use her intrinsic power in calling them," unquote. Yet why torture a single unguarded expression, seeing in the very same sentence they plainly teach, quote, "that it is free for the church to assemble together synodically as well as pro renata as at the ordinary times, by the intrinsical power received from Christ, as long as it is necessary for the good of the church so to assemble," unquote. Besides, it was evidently their intention by this act to preserve, on their part, the amicable correspondence which should ever exist between church and state, and at the same time to prevent the odium which might otherwise attach to their meetings in these troublesome times, as though they were designed to promote some seditious plans which they wished to conceal from the present government. The subordinate standards of which we speak, especially our solemn covenants, are also charged with favoring compulsory measures, even in matters purely religious. And hence it is supposed that our reformers did not properly understand the rights of private judgment, nor the proper spirit of our Saviour's doctrine, quote, "that his kingdom is not of this world," unquote. Neither this nor the above mentioned are new objections. All of them, and many others beside, were urged, if not with greater, at least with as much plausibility as they are now, more than 100 years ago. They were also very ably answered by the reformers themselves, though many of the publications on that subject are now to be obtained with difficulty, and some of them not at all. It is given as the character of the upright man that he will not be readily disposed even to take up a reproach against his neighbor. But it is matter of regret in our time that many will swallow with greediness bold and totally unfounded assertions in opposition to the covenants and work of reformation, while they will scarcely grant a hearing to strong and incontestable proof in their favor. If one, speaking at random, should tell them, quote, "Our reformers were for propagating their religion by fire and sword. They went about with the covenants in the one hand and the sword in the other, giving men their choice," unquote. At once the malicious tale is believed, opinions and principles are formed upon it, though all the while a grosser calumny never existed. Our reformers, in the possession of their religious as well as civil liberties, taught the propriety of defending themselves by arms, when they were wickedly attacked and attempts made to rob them of their valuable rights. But to the doctrine of actively propagating religion by the sword they were totally strangers. Let not our law condemn any man before it hear him, lest the heathen themselves rise against us in the judgment. With regard to the National Covenant of Scotland, respectable men of indefatigable industry and unwearied research have solemnly declared that, after a laborious investigation, they could find no proper evidence that any force was ever used in Scotland to make any take the covenant, except in 1639 by Montrose and Monroe, 2 military men without any warrant from church or state. These 2 officers, whose zeal in this affair was not according to knowledge, and who acted beyond their commission, afterwards appeared in their true colors as dangerous enemies to the work of reformation. But the unwarranted act of an individual or 2 can never be justly charged upon the great body, openly and honestly disavowing all such conduct. Messrs. Henderson, Dixon, and Cant, these eminent servants of Christ, distinguished in 1638 by their public spirit in valiantly promoting the covenanted interest, make free to assert, quote, No pastors in our knowledge have been either forced to flee or have been threatened with the want of their stipends for refusing their subscription. Arguments have been taken from promised augmentation of stipends to hinder subscription. Fear of worldly loss rather hinders men to subscribe than scruples of conscience. In this day of the Lord's power, his people have most willingly offered themselves in multitudes, like the dew of the morning. Others, of no small note, have offered their subscriptions, and have been refused till time should try their sincerity from love of the cause, and not from the fear of men. No threatenings have been used, except the deserved judgments of God, nor force, except the force of reason, from the high respects which we owe to religion, to our King, to ourselves, and to our posterity." Unquote. Speaking of the remarkable cheerfulness with which the covenant was almost universally subscribed, in 1638 says a pious writer on the subject, quote, "They resolved upon renewing the national covenant, which had been almost buried for 40 years before. Being read in churches, it was heartily embraced, sworn, and subscribed by all ranks with many tears and great joy, so that the whole land, great and small, a very few excepted, without any compulsion from church or state, did, in a few months, cheerfully return to their ancient principles, and subjected themselves to the oath of God for reformation." Unquote. On this memorable occasion, we see compulsory measures were neither needed nor employed. After the treaty at Berks in 1639, when, quote, "the king complained that the Scots still kept up unlawful meetings, who pressed their subjects daily to adhere to the covenant, Lord Loudon answered that no meetings were kept up by them but such as were agreeable to the acts of Parliament, and although they behoved to adhere to their covenant as most necessary and lawful, yet they averred that none had, to their knowledge, been urged to subscribe it." Unquote. As the king at this time strongly urged the abjuring of the covenant, our worthy reformers, considering its obligation as indissoluble, judged it seasonable, when necessity pointed out the duty of trying who were friends or foes, to offer the covenant for subscription to such of the lords of session as had not already subscribed it. The result was that the most of them refused it. Yet even these historians, who are well known to disapprove of the covenant, cannot so much as pretend that ever the least violence was offered to the recusants. Quote, "Yea," adds our author, "this had been a practical contradiction to what the Covenanters had all along declared." Unquote. Are these the men who wish to propagate the religion of Jesus by the sword of steel? In the progress of the Reformation, our noble ancestors still declare themselves the friends of that properly bounded liberty, wherewith Christ hath made his people free. The express words of the standards themselves are, quote, "God alone is Lord of the conscience, and hath left it free from the doctrines and commandments of men, which are in anything contrary to the word, or beside it, in matters of faith or worship." Unquote. They evidently consider God alone as the sovereign Lord of the conscience, and, at the same time, the conscience of every man as subject to his righteous law. Accordingly, whenever the public regulations of either church or state are actually brought to this unerring rule, fully demonstrated to be agreeable unto it, and not only so, but also solemnly ratified by the mutual consent of the representatives in either department, then all become obliged to conform, not in virtue of some men's claim to exercise lordship over the conscience of others, but in virtue of the divine authority speaking through the medium of scriptural regulations, in virtue of that mutual consent by which these regulations were adopted, and in virtue of that responsibility, not only to God, but also to one another, which is inseparable from the very existence of all society, whether civil or ecclesiastic. After this, for individuals or malignant factions, under the pretense of conscience and the right of private judgment, to rise up in open rebellion against the established authorities, is evidently to fight not only against men, but against God himself. This was exactly the case in those troublesome times, when the Confession and Covenants were composed, and it is to men of this description that our worthy reformers refer when, in the 4th section of the same chapter, they say, quote, "Because the powers which God hath ordained and the liberty which Christ hath purchased are not intended by God to destroy, but mutually to uphold and preserve one another, they who, upon pretense of Christian liberty, shall oppose any lawful power, or the lawful exercise of it, whether it be civil or ecclesiastical, resist the ordinance of God." Unquote. Such are the persons who, they say, quote, "may lawfully be called to account and proceeded against by the censures of the church and by the power of the civil magistrate." Unquote. It is in this sense, likewise, that our testimony is to be understood, when it approves of proceeding against some atrocious offenders, not only by church censures, but also by the power of the magistrate, that both the civil and ecclesiastical authority of that time agreed to have the covenants enforced by civil, as well as ecclesiastical pains, is not refused. But let the case be truly stated, and it is hoped that the seeming inconsistency of this will soon vanish. The public calamity under which the nation then groaned was twofold: strong opposition to the true Reformed religion, as openly professed in the Church, and malignant plotting against the fundamental laws and liberties of the state. Both these evils were combined in the malicious conduct of many restless and formidable factions in the land. The enemies with whom the Covenanters had to do were not simply chargeable with heretical opinions, peaceably retained within themselves, but with heretical opinions manifested, supported, and propagated in a seditious and treasonable manner. This is attested by the preamble to the Solemn League and Covenant itself, the well-authenticated histories of that period, and other unexceptionable vouchers. Quote, the miseries of Ireland, says Mr. Henderson, who was personally concerned in framing the League, and the distresses of England and the dangers of the kingdom of Scotland growing to greater extremity, the Convention of Estates, upon their meeting, received information of divers treacherous attempts of papists in all the three kingdoms. Unquote. The Westminster Assembly, in their exhortation to the taking of the covenant, expect many cheerfully, quote, to join in this happy bond, for putting an end to the present ministries, and for saving both the king and kingdom from utter ruin, now so strongly and openly labored by the popish faction, and such as have been bewitched and besotted by that viperous and bloody generation. Unquote. Speaking and contending false kinds of peace, Mr. Tisdale, a member of the Assembly, observes, quote, you may soon discover here the peace of our adversaries, the agreement of atheists and papists, priests and prelates, Irish rebels and English traitors to ruin church and commonwealth. Unquote. We see, then, that the persons of whom the malignant factions were composed sustained a double character. They were at once obstinate gainsayers of the truth, as it is in Jesus, and seditious enemies to the state. The remedy behooved to be suited unto the disease. Accordingly, we find that the Solemn League, though loosely taken, it may be considered as a religious covenant, yet when strictly viewed, is evidently a complex oath containing not only a religious vow to be for God and not for another, but also an oath of allegiance to the civil government in the defense of the nation's precious liberties. No wonder, then, that the censures be also twofold, civil and ecclesiastical pains. But were they administered indiscriminately and out of their proper place? By no means. Considered simply as obstinate enemies to the religion of Jesus, or as scandalous in their practice, the offenders were brought before the Church and proceeded against by her censures, sometimes even to excommunication. But proving, as many of them did, still irreclaimable, and persisting in their seditious and treasonable measures, they were also considered as rebels in the state, and were then, and not sooner, delivered over to the civil power to be punished accordingly. Is it not still the custom, and reckoned a warrantable custom too, to punish seditious and treasonable persons with civil pains? It will, no doubt, be objected, quote, why did our reformers give their covenant to this form? Could they not have framed two distinct covenants or oaths, the one civil and the other religious? Unquote. To this we reply that, from the calamitous circumstances of the time, they could scarcely be considered as having proper room left for a choice in that respect. The complex evil and the double character were already before them, and therefore they framed their covenant so as to meet the double danger. They might, indeed, have split it into two, and sworn the one on the one day and the other on the other. But where would have been the substantial difference? If things are kept distinct in themselves, and each observed in its own place, though they should be done by the same men and on the same general occasion, the harm cannot be very great. Doth not the Christian, acting in character, perform both civil and religious duties every day of his life? Why, then, may he not, in the same covenant, solemnly engage to do both? But in order to substantiate the charge of compulsory measures in matters of religion, a character must be found exactly of the following description: a person, in every other respect a peaceable and inoffensive member of society, propagating no opinions, nor chargeable with any practices injurious to the peace and happiness of mankind, but only found to entertain some religious scruples in his own mind about the propriety of the covenants, or such like, in all other respects harmless. If it can be proved that men of this description had corporal punishments inflicted upon them by the authority of church and state, it will be doing something to the purpose. But all arguing from the complex character, without attending to the distinctions observed by our reformers themselves, is evidently inconclusive. As it is a subject of much discussion in our times, we crave the attention of our readers to a few additional extracts out of many which might be produced in defense of the ancient Covenanters against the charge of unwarrantable compulsion in matters purely religious.